Okay. Okay, so let's screen share the blessing if you would, Bill. Thank you so much. Okay, everybody in unison. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Let's pray. You, source of all life and holiness, who has commanded us to study your sacred texts. Amen. May we glean some useful wisdom on this day in the last parsha of Genesis. Hi, Paul. Good to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Is that working? Yeah, great. Okay. So I talked a little bit about this last night, about the cycle and of violence in Genesis. And I want to look specifically at how the book ends, the dynamics between the brothers, and you'll see a very specific word which occurs in interesting places that I think will, I hope, help us understand the nature of the family dynamic at the end of the book. To me, and I hope some people might disagree, the book ends in despair, really in utter despair. But thank God there's another book after this one, and then another one, and another one, and another one. So let's see what happens here. So here we are, Jacob dies. And it says, "Vayasu ba'anav lo ken asher tzivam." Thus his sons did for him as he had instructed them. "Vayisu oto banav artzah Canaan, vayikberu oto b'ma'arat stei hamachpelah, asher kana Abraham et hasadel achuzat keber, me'et Ephron Hiti al penei Mamre." His sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah, the field near Mamre, which Abraham had bought as a burial site from Ephron the Hittite. Remember, Abraham did that after Sarah died, making way for this ancestral, cemetery. Vayashav Yosef Mitzrayima, hu be'echav, v'kol ha'olim ito l'chbor et aviv, achalei kavro. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt. He and his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. Okay, so now here's where things get interesting. Okay, that's in itself strange. Joseph's brothers saw that their father died. What do you mean they saw? I mean, didn't they notice before this? Vayamru. Lu yistamenu Yosef, v'hashev yashiv lanu et kol hara'ah asher gamalnu oto. So here it says when. I don't think when is really in the Hebrew, but Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. They said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong that we did?"
Couldn't Vayiru also mean they feared?
It could be Vayiru, yes. It could also be they feared. Vayiru et Yosef next. But that doesn't really make sense in a sentence, does it, Alan?
I think so.
How would you translate it?
They were afraid because their father had died. They were afraid
that their father died. I see. They're afraid since their father died. Yeah, okay, that could work. Asher Chaim, what do you think? No, he says no.
Yes, no.
Thank God I'm Asher Chaim up there.
I didn't
think so, but I need confirmation. Okay, so what I want to look at, and we're going to do a lot here. There's a lot to do today. But I want to follow specifically, or at least part of what we're going to do, is follow the word yistamenu. Yistamenu. So, here. To hate, oppose, bear a grudge, retain animosity against, cherish animosity against. So it's, it's this ongoing hatred that we'll see leads to revenge or the desire for revenge. And also just this concept of asher gamalnu oto, right? All the evil, let's see, asher gamal, that we did to him. Gamal is also a camel. I'm just thinking about, I'm not sure exactly how to articulate the force of that word here. All the evil that we, I guess, bestowed upon him. Okay, if anyone has a better idea, feel free to put it in the chat at this point. Okay, and of course, right here in essence is, or are the seeds of the cycle of violence, right? Someone does me wrong and I want to pay them back. I want to somehow make it even, right? It's like I want to somehow make things right in a sense by taking revenge. I'm going to go on for a while, Nikki. I'm sorry. I'm going to go a while, put a lot of material under our belt, and then I will open things up.
It's about revenge.
That's fine. That's good. Okay, Asher Chaim says, and they feared has an extra yud. So why does that matter?
Because it doesn't have one here.
Oh, so I'm sorry, where does it have an extra yud?
Vayiru with one yud, and they saw. Vayiru with two yuds, and they feared.
Thank you very much. Okay, so here's something interesting from Rashi. So how did the brothers know that somehow Joseph's attitude towards them was different? And so they construct a scene, and I love it because it's like very concrete and you can imagine it. Ma vayiru, and what is the meaning of they saw? Hikiru b'mitato etzel Yosef, shahayu regilim lis'od al shulchano shel Yosef, v'haya mikavan b'shvil kavod aviv, u'mishemet Yaakov lo keravan. They could perceive that he was dead. What is the meaning of and they saw? They could perceive that he was dead through the conduct of Joseph. Previously, they used to dine at Joseph's table and used to receive him with open arms out of respect to his father. After Jacob's death, however, he no longer treated them in a friendly manner. He no longer, literally in the Hebrew, brought them close. So there's something about, often when someone dies in the family, the dynamics shift. And here, what Rashi is saying, the way they shifted is that the family kind of began to fragment. Okay. So here we have some comments from Aviva Zornberg. Can someone read that in English? In a loud voice. Andrea, do you feel like reading?
Sure. Fear of vengeance.
Yeah, fear of vengeance.
Suddenly there emerges a last-minute qualm. For the first time, the brothers articulate a fear of Joseph's vengeance for that long, buried day in the pit. What brings this fear to the surface is that they saw that their father was dead. Again, the repeated reference to the departure of the father makes one wonder what symbolic meaning this has for the brothers. In this vein, Rashi responds to the apparent banality of the observation. What is the meaning of they saw? They realized the meaning of his death in Joseph's behavior. Previously, they used to dine at Joseph's table, and he used to receive them with open arms out of respect for his father. After Jacob's death, however, he no longer treated them in a friendly manner. Rashi's scenario explains the brothers' sudden eruption of fear. Joseph's behavior has changed ominously since Jacob's death. Death, even burial, is not necessarily closure. On the contrary, this death seems to open up unnerving possibilities.
So well said. I will just add, so it's not only Joseph's vengeance for that long buried day in the pit. He was sold into slavery. He was kidnapped. He spent years, I think it was 17, if I'm remembering correctly, right, in Egypt, in exile, away from his family. Did one of them go see what happened to him? Right? Did anyone contact him? An email, a text, a phone call, anything? No, they didn't seek him. They knew he was missing from the pit, and that's it. They pretended, right, that a wild animal had eaten him to their father. Closed story. Until they needed something. But even then, they didn't go seek Joseph. They found Joseph by accident or divine coincidence. Okay. So here's what happens. So this is really fascinating. Vitzavu el Yosef. I'm now in source 5. Vitzavu el Yosef lemora. Avicha siva lifnei motot lemor. So they sent this message to Joseph. Okay, so the brothers are scared. So what do? They send a message to Joseph. They say, before his death, your father left this instruction. Ko tamru li Yosef. Here's what you should say to Yosef. Ana sa na pesha achecha v'chatatam ki ra'a gimalucha. Vata sa na lefesha avdei Elohei avicha v'yech Yosef b'dabram elav. So shall you say to Joseph, forgive, I urge you, the offense and guilt of your brothers who treated you so harshly. Therefore, please forgive the offense of the servants of the God of your father's house. And Joseph was in tears as they spoke to him. Okay, so nowhere in the text is this instruction before this moment. So the question are Joseph's brothers making this up? It seems like it's kind of, constructed for the moment, right? It's a very, very, almost too perfect message for what they need. Oh, this is what your father said before he died. Okay. Okay, and then Joseph cries. So why does he cry? So we'll see some midrash about that. Hinenu l'cha avadim. His brothers went to him themselves, flung themselves before him, and said, we are prepared to be your slaves. Now that is strange. Why are they prepared to be his slaves? What's happening here? And what's interesting is the word slave, right? The root for slave from Genesis 37, when Joseph is sold into slavery, until now appears many times. I tried to figure out how many times before a session, but I was unsuccessful. This root appears many times in the Joseph story, and almost as if it's like an interesting preparation for the slavery of the Israelites in Egypt. Right? And here the brothers say, here we are, we're your slave. Bizarre. And how is that a response to their feeling of guilt? Like, what's happening here? So I'll put that question on the table, and we'll open it up in a few minutes, okay? Okay, so now this amazing midrash from Tanhuma, and a couple more texts, and then I'll open things up. Okay. All right. Asher Chaim, do you feel like reading? Yeah? Okay. We're in source 6.
Vayir'u ahei Yosef kimet avihem, umara'u ata shepahadu. The brothers of Yosef saw that their father had died. What did they now see that caused them to fear? Ela b'eit shehazru meqvurat avihem, ra'u shehalach Yosef levarech al oto habor sheishlichuhu ahav betocho. On their way back from the burial of their father, they saw that Yosef detoured to bless the pit that his brothers had thrown him into. Uberach alav, כמו שחייב אדם לברך על מקום שעשה לו נס, ברוך המקום שעשה לו נס במקום הזה. This is to fulfill the obligation to bless a place where a miracle was formed.
Okay, so let's stop there for a minute. This is an amazing midrashic image. Joseph went to the pit where they had thrown him and blessed it because a miracle was done him. So what was the miracle done him? The only miracle I can imagine is that eventually his life was saved. He became a ruler in Egypt. He saved an entire region from famine, as well as his family, right? But it takes great sort of distance and sort of emotional resolution to be able to bless the place of such trauma. It reminds me, many of you know my daughter was very sick and she's fine now with cancer when she was 16. When we go back to Sloan Kettering for scans, no one feels like blessing that place, right? Hopefully one day, and I think I'll get there before she does, God willing, we'll feel like blessing the place that saved her life. But it takes great emotional maturity and resolution. And yet, the brothers interpret this moment, according to the Midrash, much differently. They probably didn't overhear the blessing. Go on, Asherai.
When they saw this, Amru, Achshav Meit Avinu, Lu Yistamenu Yosef Vashev Yashiv Lanu, Et Kol Hara Asher Gamalnu Oto. When they saw this, they said or thought, now that our father is dead, perhaps Yosef will have enmity against us and deal back to us for all of the evil that we caused him.
So again, that word yistamenu, that word for enmity or like harboring a grudge. And again, that sense of like Joseph will get back at us. This ongoing fear of Joseph will get back at us for what we did to him.
Vaisavu el Yosef lemor avicha siva v'chulei. And that's why they told the story to Yosef. Kotomrun le Yosef, say thus to Joseph, please, etc. Chipasnu v'lo masanu shetziva Yaakov davar zeh. We have searched and we have not found that Yaakov left this testament. Ela bor'e kama gadol koach hashalom. But come see the power of peace. Shekatav Kadosh Baruch Hu b'Torato al koach hashalom elu hadvarim. That the Holy One inscribed these words in the divine Torah for the sake of peace alone.
So in other words, the brothers are searching for a way to make peace with Joseph. So they make this up, and it's a good thing because it was for the sake of peace. Okay. So
one step further.
Yeah.
Like the Midrash earlier about with the Annunciation to Sarah, that God is willing to insert words in the Torah in order to create peace.
Nice. That's right. Okay, and then Genesis 50. So we're going to go on with this story for a few minutes. Vayomer alehem Yosef, al tira'u. So Joseph says to them, don't be scared. Am I instead of God? Va'atem chashavtam alai ra'ah. And you have thought about me evil. Elohim chashava l'tova l'ma'an asa kayom hazeh l'chayot am rav. But God intended it for good, so to bring about the present result, the survival of so many people. V'ata al tira'u v'ata al tira'u. And now don't be scared. Anochi achalkel etchem ve'et hachem. I will sustain you and your dependents, your children, your little ones. Thus he reassured them, and he comforted them, and spoke to their hearts. Okay, I'll do that. Okay, we're going to read one more Jonathan Sachs, look at this visual midrash, and then I'll open things up. So, Audrey, can you continue by reading source 10?
The text makes it as plain as possible that the story they told Joseph was a lie. If Jacob had really said those words, he would have said them to Joseph himself, not to the brothers. The time to have done so was on his deathbed in the previous chapter. The brothers' tale was a white lie. Its primary aim was not to deceive, but to ease a potentially explosive situation. Perhaps that is why Joseph wept, understanding that his brothers still thought him capable of revenge. The sages derived a principle from this text. Mutar leshonot mipnei hashalom. It is permitted to tell an untruth for the sake of peace. A white lie is permitted in Jewish law.
Okay. Ricardo thinks that's so funny. And here's a fabulous visual midrash of Joseph saying, "Am I instead of God to his brothers?" And you could see the sense here in this midrash of the sort of the disunity of the brothers and their anxiety. At least that's what I get from this midrash. Okay, all right, let's open things up for a little while, see what people have to say, if anything. And Nikki, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, it's just that this entire chapter, as you were so eloquent about the book of Genesis last night, and all the quid pro quos that take place in it. There's an Italian proverb: if you want to take revenge, first dig 2 graves.
Ooh.
And that's what, a lot of this is about. But
Yeah.
Joseph seems to be breaking that.
It's an unending cycle in this book, and it ends, I think, on a bad note. Yeah, Marla.
Regarding when they said, make us your slave, I was thinking about the connection, at least when I work with patients, when people talk about guilt, there's usually one of two, if not both, feelings underneath: fear and resentment. So on one hand, I feel like it's a kind of fear response of, we'll do anything you say, And also, when people are resentful, they can become quite vengeful guilt can make people feel they resent the feeling. Then it's how they react on that resentment that can sort of set a lot of things in motion.
So it's the discomfort with the guilt that sort of they give their power over to somebody else. And it reminds me of like Hegel and like the master-slave kind of slave consciousness.
Yeah. And it could be a kind of defensive move in a very real politic kind of way, like, we'll do whatever you say, we'll make you our slaves. Or it could be, I guess the most benevolent way to look at it would be that they've had this kind of enlightenment, but I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I'm not
about
reading
that.
enlightenment here.
Yeah.
Survival.
Okay, I'm going to go around the room.
Yeah.
Alan?
I had a question which may speak to the question of whether it was a lie or not. Did the brothers ever make peace with their father? They apologized to Joseph, but did they apologize to their father?
Did they apologize
They
to
never
Joseph?
apologized to Joseph.
Yeah, I don't think they quite apologize.
And
There's some consciousness, especially in Judah's speech, of the impact they had on their brother and their father. It's not quite an apology, and we'll see some commentary.
right, because Yaakov may have been clueless about how Joseph ended up in Egypt. You'd think he would ask some questions, but
yes. We're gonna address that as well. Was he clueless or not about what happened? Okay, yeah.
I guess I'm a little unclear about the full definition of revenge. I mean, I think in this case, perhaps it's clear, but are there cases where someone might refer to an action as revenge when the person who's actually taking that action is in fact validly defending themselves? And I can think of a number of cases where one might need to take an action in order to survive. Is that actually revenge?
I would say not. I would say that's different.
But to another person, that might be considered revenge
Fine
because
line.
they're, pardon?
Fine line.
A fine
But
line, and
here-
it's a little elastic.
But here it doesn't seem to be, because the brothers are worried that Joseph will take revenge, but Joseph doesn't need to protect himself.
But if we're talking about the larger issue of revenge and whether
Correct.
one should take
Correct.
revenge.
I think those are tricky questions,
Mhm.
and protecting oneself, I would say, is important to distinguish when possible.
And it might be hard to know.
And it might be hard, right?
Yeah.
Especially when there's a vengeful feeling in that protection.
Complicated. Yeah.
Complicated. Okay, Tony.
As always,
Andrea?
Buber puts it, I think, quite well when he says.
Yeah, say it a little louder. I have to Zoom.
As always, Buber puts it quite well when he says, we need to fight in this world, but we need to fight lovingly. And so the question from a kind of, among other things, right speech standpoint of the Buddha, how can we defend ourselves and protect ourselves with a minimum of damage and a maximum of compassion and consideration?
Okay, great question. Thank you. Andrea?
Yeah, it struck me this time I'm reading it in a way that had never before, is that maybe Joseph is weeping because he suddenly, when his brothers show up with so much fear, he suddenly realizes that he is still harboring resentment and anger towards them, even though time has passed and he think, he's done this, wonderful thing and saved his family. Like he's realizing maybe that he still hasn't actually had resolution overall.
So either he's crying because he's still harboring resentment, or he's crying because he's moved on and they haven't.
Which is how I used to read it.
And there's
but
such
that
a distance between them.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Right?
That's how I'm reading it. But I see you're reading too. And by the way, the measure of my success in teaching is when someone says, "I've never seen it this way before." So now we could just end the session. Okay, anyone? Oh, Alana wanted to say something.
Shabbat Shalom. Yeah, I wanted to speak actually to the same point, that to respectfully disagree with Rabbi Sachs, and I think about Yosef's weeping as a kind of response to grief and kind of reiteration of some betrayal by his brothers, that they don't come face to face with him, first of all. They don't come with the ground of forgiveness. They don't face him. They again mess with or perpetrate with his relationship with his father by lying to him about his father. So for me, it seems like that weeping comes from recognition that forgiveness is not going to happen. It is impossible. And so that Yosef's shift to an explanation that frames everything with God, that it's God's will. This is the second time he's done it. To me, it seems like both a spiritual bypass, but also a kind of relational retreat, that underneath it all, he's saying, there is no way we're ever going to resolve this. You're not facing me. You're not witnessing me. The essential material for forgiveness is lacking. So the only way I'm going to get through this is not with you, my brothers. Like there is going to be no reconciliation, but to shift to this other explanation, which is maybe his coping mechanism.
Thank you, Alana. And I think that's a good explication of, how this book ends on a tragic note. Like they're missing each other somehow. All right. I see 3 people on Zoom, and then we're going to go on with our material after that. So, Beth, Alina, and Jay, and I'm going to ask people to be concise as possible.
Shalom.
Hi, Beth.
One of the things that makes the entreaties of the brothers to Joseph tragic is that they don't go themselves, they send messengers.
Ooh, nice point.
And it's very clear that this whole time that everybody's been living in Egypt, this has never gotten hashed out. And also, considering that these are sibling relationships, there's an awful lot of things about sibling relationships that never get worked out.
Okay, Beth, your audio's not great.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll get a little closer to the mic. Maybe that'll help. I have a cold, so maybe my voice is...
Oh, sorry to hear that.
But sibling relationships especially, they run so deep and they were formed when we were small and didn't know any better. And I happened to have spoken to both of my brothers shortly before they died. And while we were on a path of reconciliation, we never actually got there. And I don't think we would have, no matter how long either of them.
Thank you, Shamati. Thank you. Okay, Alina, and then Jay, and then back to our text.
Oh, this whole thing makes me jump ahead to Exodus. and to feel that the ignorance of the brothers, keeping that revenge, they created hate in their fear and their revenge, and we've all suffered from it. The whole human story that follows comes out of this ignorance. Created that kind of reaction to the evolution of brothers. They couldn't evolve. They didn't evolve. They did. So that led us all into the next.
They seem to be stuck in a moment. I agree with you.
But it also created, in a sense, the karma that the whole people got pulled into it.
This karma of slavery.
Yes.
Yeah. 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 And they're saying, we'll be slave. Like they're offering to enter that state of being. Yeah.
Then the whole
Okay.
human Jews do this for the next thousands of years, you know. So it feels like a moment of ignorance, of that sense of belief and hate. But that's what
Belief and hate has gotten a new lease lately.
Jay.
Yeah, I want to stay away from that subtext, but I do want to.
sorry about that.
I do want to throw my hat into this emerging counter narrative, because I do think that this is really all about the lack of resolution. And if there's a white lie here, it's really a white lie for the sake of the narrative, as opposed to any real reconciliation. The issue of slaves, I think it was in last week's Parsha where initially, when everything's unmasked, they offered to be Joseph's slaves.
The Egyptians offered to be Joseph's slaves, or Joseph enslaved them. Is that what you're saying?
No, I believe the brothers, in one of the earlier interactions, the brothers, in a way of ingratiating themselves to Joseph when all was revealed, they offered to be his slaves. Also, maybe instead of Benjamin, instead of taking Benjamin, etc. So that is a theme, and it's really about power and what kind of reconciliation can really happen under this asymmetry of power. And when is Shalom Bayit? I mean, when is it a real full healing resolution, and when is it something that's kind of papered over for this, almost the sake of the narrative, to keep going on?
Yeah. So Shalom Bayit is the piece of the household, but it's I agree with you, as a kind of papered over piece, right? And it seems to be like the propulsion of the narrative is going towards slavery, right? So we're going from the prophecy to Abraham earlier on in the story, that your descendants, right, will be slaves for 400 years, and then it turns out 200 years. And then they will come out knowing God. But now we're at the moment of just entering slavery. And as soon as Joseph is thrown down into the pit, right, the narrative goes down, because then Joseph goes down into Egypt, and then the family goes down into Egypt. So there's all this movement down before they're lifted up again. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so let's just see. Okay, so this is interesting. Rabbeinu Bachya on chapter 50. Vayef Yosef Kidibram Elav. So why did Joseph weep when they talked to him? Tekev shehiskiro lo aviv, l'cho l'godel ha'ava, v'nichmeru rachamav, v'hinei echav bakshu mimenu mechila, v'lo be'er hakatuv shemachal lahem. Okay, so as soon as the brothers merely mentioned the name of their father, Joseph already started weeping. This was due to the great love he had for his now departed father. This stirred his sense of compassion, especially seeing that his brothers asked his forgiveness. The Kvar Be'eru Rabbeinu Zichrono Levracham Shekol Mi Shechata L'Chavero V'Asat Shruva Eino Nimcha L'Olam Ad Sheyirtza El Chavero. So the Torah does not spell out that Joseph actually forgave his brothers. Our sages in Bava Kama and the Talmud point out that if a person has wronged his fellow man and regrets this wrong and determines not to act in the manner which had offended his fellow man, he is not forgiven by God until after he has made an effort to obtain forgiveness by the aggrieved party first. Okay. ואף על פי שהזכיר הכתוב וינחם אותם וידבר על ליבם, שנראה בזה שהיה להם רצוי מיוסף מכל מקום, לא ראינו שיזכיר הכתוב נחילה ביוסף, ולא שיוודע להם שיישא פשעם וחטאתם, ואם כן מתו בעונשם, ולא נחילת יוסף. And anyway, the Torah is not on record anywhere that Joseph did forgive his brothers, and it says also in the Hebrew that they died, right? They died, with their punishment and without the forgiveness of Joseph, right? So this points to the non-resolution of these relationships. Okay, so now back to Diva Zornberg. Can someone read this in English?
In this final scene, Joseph weeps his most enigmatic tears. He wept Beit Abraham Elav, literally at their speaking to him. Perhaps he weeps at the distance of suspicion that still divides him from his brothers. Sure of his own good intentions, he weeps at their fear. Or perhaps he weeps at the manner of their addressing him. For actually, they are not speaking to him. They communicate through a messenger who reports a fabricated message containing deathbed instructions in their father's name and words to ask Joseph for forgiveness. If one were to write the verse, the core of the message, the confession and plea for forgiveness, would be hedged about with a forest of quotation marks. In other words, the brother's plea is indirect and equivocal to the point of absurdity. This is the only way, it seems, that they can speak to him. Joseph weeps then at the failure of language to maintain itself in the family after Jacob's death.
That last line, right, is the killer.
Isn't
Like
that
the
the story?
failure of language, failure of communication. Okay, let's go to Genesis 50. Ashchaim, do you feel like reading? Oh, and Ashchaim, you want to say something, and then I'll ask you to read.
If it's okay to bring some commentary now, or
Yeah.
did you want to read first?
Yeah. Go ahead. No, say what you have to say.
Part of the pathos, as I read the elephant in the room, at some point, Jacob's going to ask Joseph, so how did you get down to Egypt to become this ruler? And Joseph's answer seems to be, God sent me.
Right.
Full stop. So
Right.
when the brothers say in their father's name that their father asked Joseph to forgive the brothers, as far as Joseph knows, Jacob has no reason to ask them to forgive, because what's there to forgive? Joseph didn't say, my brothers threw me in a pit. How would Jacob know that? So perhaps he weeps because it's so obviously false, or the secret got out when he didn't want it to get out. But in either case, that wonderful pair of verses that we had before he was thrown in the pit, Joseph says, I am looking for my brothers. And then it says, they saw him from a distance. And here, no matter what, Joseph's dream of having his brothers all bow down to him has come true. And he still can't find the way to seek his brothers without them seeing him from a distance.
Oh, that's really good. That's
Oof.
Beautiful.
Oof.
So there's no direct communication. There's no real face-to-face encounter.
Snap.
Okay, read Genesis 50 now. Thank you.
וישב יוסף במצרים, הוא ובית אביו, והיה 10 שנים. Yosef dwelled in Mitzrayim, he and his father's household, and Yosef lived 110 years. וירא יוסף לאפרים בני שלשים גם בני מכיר ben Menashe יולדו על ברכי Yosef. Yosef saw from Ephraim grandchildren, and even the children of his grandson Machir ben Menashe were born on his knees. ויאמר יוסף אל אחיו, אנוכי מת, ואלוהים פקוד יפקוד אתכם, והעלה אתכם מן הארץ הזאת, אל הארץ אשר נשבע לאברהם, ליצחק וליעקב. Yosef said to his brothers, I am going to die, and Elohim will surely take account of you and bring you all out of this land to the land which was promised to Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. וישבע יוסף את בני ישראל לאמור, הכל יפקוד אלוהים אתכם ועליתם את עצמותיים מזה. Yosef made the children of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take account of you, and you shall bring my bones from this place. וימות יוסף בן 110 שנים, ויחנתו אותו, וייתם בארון במצרים. Yosef died at the age of 110 years. They embalmed him, and he was placed in a coffin in Egypt.
Great, thank you, Asher Chaim. So a couple of things about this passage. One is going up is mentioned a few times in 24, that God will raise them up from Egypt, and also he wants to be raised up. So there's, even though, this book ends on a kind of depraved note, one could say, or a very tragic note, Joseph has a hope of being raised up even after death, which I find beautiful, because there's some intentionality even beyond his lifetime. And then note here that the entire book ends in darkness, right? He's embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Okay, I know, Paul, I saw your hand up there, and I'll call
But
you
a
in a minute.
soft darkness, not a darkness that's necessarily a bad darkness.
Darkness.
Okay.
Okay, so now let's go back. We're following that word, vayistemuhu. I'm not going to call on people twice. I'm so sorry. Unless there's time. Okay. Vayistemuhu. So here's all the blessings from Jacob to his sons are absolutely enigmatic. They're very sort of ancient poetry. They're really hard to understand. And I heard a really interesting interpretation that I wanted to share with you, which I think might shed some light on this cycle of violence. So it says here, Ben Parat Yosef, Ben Parat, Alei Ayin, Banot Sa'ada Alei Shur. Joseph is a wild ass by a spring. Why Jacob is calling him that, and that's part of the blessing, I have no idea. So if anyone wants to remark on that in the chat, you're welcome to. Wild colts on a hillside. Others, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring, its branches run over a wall. So some natural imagery, and this sense of wildness.
Amazing.
Okay, we'll find out why we think it's amazing soon. Okay, so now here's where it gets potentially interesting. Vayimaruhu varobo vayistemuhu ba'alei chitzim. So archers bitterly assailed him. They shot at him and harried him. So let's think about this word vayistemuhu. We're going to go down for a second to another generation. And if you remember, Vayistom Esav et Yaakov al habracha asher bercho aviv. Now Esav harbored a grudge against Joseph, right? Because of the blessing which his father had given him. And if you recall, Jacob stole Esav's blessing by pretending he was Esav. And Esav said to himself, Vayomer Esav b'libo, in his heart, Yikruvu yemei ha'evel avi. Let but the mourning period of my father come. I will kill my brother Jacob. So here we have in a previous generation this vengeful hatred and this plan for murder once his father dies. So now we have in a later generation a father dying and that same fear bubbling up. Okay, so perhaps this blessing reflects Jacob's own experience, right, with Esau, and his understanding, maybe some understanding that that's also going on with his own children, right? That cycle of violence, that sense of revenge is happening with his children. But what's happening with all these archers? What's going on with all these archers bitterly assailed him, they shot at him and harried him? So that's in the interpretation I heard, and this is by, I'll show you this in a second, from Aleph Beta, Immanuel Shalev, Imu Shalev. Okay, I'm going back up. Because his brothers sort of, tried and did take revenge on him, right? And they couldn't sort of manage their own jealousy. And yet it says in 24, Vateshev etan kashto vayafozu zor'e yadav midei avir Yaakov misham ro'eh even Yisrael. Yet his bow stayed taut, and his arms were made firm by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. There the shepherd, the rock of Israel. So the way Imu Shalev interprets this is that even though his brothers all assailed him, they couldn't manage their own desire for revengeance and jealousy, he managed his own impulse for revenge. Yeah. So even though he tortured them in Egypt, in the end, he took care of them. Right? He did torture them for a while. He laid them, right, big time. And then he cared for them, right? He fed them. He brought their father along. He put them in Goshen. He assured them. He managed his own impulse for revenge.
Like
right?
Esau.
Like
Esau, who was an archer.
Exactly. I was thinking about Esau. It also takes us back to a different generation. Esau was an archer, and it's so interesting because he was abandoned the measure of a bow shot and became an archer. Yeah.
And Ishmael was an archer. Ishmael.
Oh no, you're right. It wasn't Esau. It was Ishmael.
And wasn't Ishmael referred to as a wild ass man?
Oh, you're right. Esau was a hunter.
But
Absolutely right.
Ishmael profession was an archer.
Yes. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to go on, and I just had to put this in here from Pirkei Avot. Ezehu Gibor HaKovesh et Yisrael, who is mighty, right? He who subdues his inclinations, right? His impulses. And that, I think, maybe is what the blessing is saying. That even though he was assailed by his brothers, he managed at some point to master his own impulses and to maybe break that cycle of violence. Okay. Okay, we saw this. We have a lot. Okay, so we're just going to read one session, and I see a lot of hands. I'm not going to take doubles from people who've already spoken. So we're going to read this by Aviva Zorenberg, and I'm going to open things up. Can someone read this? Source 20.
I'll read it.
Go ahead.
The word for hatred here is the unusual yistamenu rather than yisnenu.
So it's not hatred, it's yistamenu, this vengeful hatred that one harbors. Go on.
This rather rare expression occurs 3 times in Genesis. The first occasion is immediately after Esau loses his blessing to his brother Jacob. And Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing which his father had given him. And Esau said to himself, "Let but the mourning period of my father come, and I will kill my brother Jacob." Esau's resentment is not at all allayed by the alternative blessing that he's received from his father. On the contrary, this blessing seems to trigger his
hatred.
I can't find the passage.
The other way.
His hatred, as though reminding him of Jacob's usurpation. He waits only for his father's death to vent this by killing Jacob. This is revenge hatred, unappeasable, biding its time till the father dies. The second time this hatred appears is in Jacob's blessing of Joseph. The archers hated him. This refers to the brothers' hatred of Joseph and uses the metaphor of archery for their malicious language, Rashi. From these three uses of sitma in Genesis, a particular genre of hatred emerges: sibling hatred, repressed in the father's lifetime, biding its time for the fratricidal moment. The brothers clearly assume that Joseph has been nursing his hatred against the day he will be free to express it. This is the dreaded implication of Jacob's death. Midrash Tanhuma, in fact, translates the term to refer to the repressed malice in Joseph's heart, and it requires nothing more sinister than a cooling in Joseph's behavior to stir up his brother's worst apprehensions. That's why I think he sends a messenger, because they're afraid.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, Paul Ullman. Paul Ullman. Okay,
This is the 1 year anniversary of Paul's bar mitzvah.
It's a 1 year anniversary of Paul's bar mitzvah.
Mazel tov,
Yay,
mazel tov.
Paul.
This is
This is
Go.
Paul. This is your parsha. Go ahead, and then Mark after that.
It is a remarkable parsha. It's undoubtedly the best parsha. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the word forgiveness and what it means to be forgiven or to forgive. And it occurs to me that the reason that Joseph is weeping is that he understands how hard it is. And the nature of forgiveness is ultimately not about words. It's about silence. It's about understanding and being willing and comfortable in someone else's presence, regardless of the complications of the prior relationship. And Joseph understands that, and he weeps bitterly because he knows how far away he and his brothers really are from true forgiveness, because no one stops talking. And so he doesn't ask them to bury him in Canaan. He knows that he has to remain in Egypt for 400 years before maybe there's a point of reconciliation.
Amazing. I love what you said about silence and forgiveness. And it also strikes me that somehow one has to accept the complexity of a relationship and continue anyway without resolving everything. Like revenge tries to make things neat and it's impossible. Okay, Mark Allen Horn.
Good morning. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Good to see you, Mark.
Good to see you. And strangely enough, last night I was watching videos of Japanese archers practicing. And if I had not seen that, I don't think I would have really understood the verses in Jacob's deathbed speech and blessing of the brothers when he comes to Joseph. Because when, it reads, archers bitterly assailed him, they shot at him and harried him, yet his bow stayed taut. That means that he was ready to shoot. He shot at any time, and to actually hold the bow so that it stays taut, you are exerting an extraordinary amount of both strength and control, and you are aiming. So it's almost as though I'm reading this and I'm thinking, Jacob realized that Joseph was holding this anger all this time and might have been waiting for him to die to let loose the arrow. But simply saying that, and when the brothers come and say to him, forgive us, we'll be your slaves. Almost so he finally relaxed, because he recognizes that he's holding himself taut all this time, and he's weeping not really for them, but for the anger that he's been holding all this time, that he finally let go of.
The anger and the pain, yeah.
The pain, indeed.
Yeah. Wow. I read somewhere that it's actually harder to hold the bow than to release it. It takes more strength.
Yes.
Yeah, when I was literally, I was watching, and they were showing this from the back, and you were seeing the muscles that were being tense and held. It was extraordinary.
Okay. Okay, let me just see. Is there anyone else? Okay, Ezra.
I think that I am reading this from a much more cynical lens.
More cynical?
Much more cynical.
Okay, good.
Because I'm coming from the point of view of like a queer person who's seen familial rejection and seen it from all the people around me.
Yeah.
And to me, it feels like he's crying solely because he knows that this is an insincere apology. And he feels that like, now you're overcompensating, you're not being sincere with me, and it just feels like an empty apology in order to retain peace.
Yeah.
And I know the pain of that, and it doesn't feel like a sincere mourning, it's just more of I know that you really don't care, you just want to maintain peace, you want to protect yourself, this doesn't feel any genuine at all.
Yeah, oh, I'm totally with you. I think they're just trying to protect themselves, and it's manipulative.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's something so endlessly painful about that, right? That kind of missing each other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, okay, I'm sorry, I just wanna, there's no one, okay, Rhoda and then Wendy.
Well, I don't think we hear how Joseph evolves into really feeling that it was God's mission. But of course he pretty busy in his job, but he did evolve into that, to really feel the divinity. We wonder what his brothers have been doing all this time. And I feel he's crying again because of this emptiness, that they can't reach each other, because he understands that we are part of God and they don't. And the other thing I was wondering about
But I just want to stop there, Rhoda, for a second, because I think what you're saying is really interesting. How do people of different sort of stages of development and emotional maturity communicate with each other? Right? They're missing each other because they're still stuck in a place and he seems not to be. Right? That in itself is tragic.
Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah.
I've had that. And also, does the Torah tell us about the descendants of the brothers? Do they all have to start at the same level, or do we?
Well, the next book opens with slavery. The next book opens with slavery, but as I spoke about last night in my sermon, the book of liberation, the book of Exodus, starts off with a whole different relationship between brothers and sisters. It's like brothers and sisters that serve as each other's guardians. Right? It's going back to Cain's, horrible answer to God's question, "Where is your brother?" It's like, I don't know. Like, am I my brother's keeper? Like, yes, you are. Right? So in Exodus, yes, they are. So there's so the book begins in a very dark place with a Pharaoh who wants to kill children, and yet brothers and sisters that stand up for each other.
Yeah.
And not only that, but people like the daughter of Pharaoh and the midwives, who are not even brothers and sisters, and stand up for the oppressed Israelites. So it's a whole different ethos. Okay, who else is Wendy?
If you go back a little bit, when Jacob goes to bless Joseph's sons, he doesn't really know them. He doesn't really recognize them. And the amount of time that Joseph was separated from his family versus the amount of time they were reunited and on his deathbed is about the same amount
Yeah, I
of time.
think it's 17 and 17 and then 17.
Right, 17 years. So he's had 17 years to reunite with his family, and he obviously kept himself a little bit separated from them because his father doesn't even recognize his children when he goes to bless them. And I think there's an important point here that has got nothing to do with the emotions, but just the time separation. I'm going to give a brief story within my own family. My grandmother came to this country with her sister and her father just prior to World War I. When World War I started, she became separated from her mom and her other 5 siblings in Russia. They didn't see each other for 10 years.
Wow.
For 10 years. When the last time my grandmother saw her mother, she was 12, and the next time she saw her, she was 22.
Wow.
And she was already a married woman with a child by the time she saw her mother again. And even though there was never any discourse between the families in any way, shape, or form, like with Joseph, just that time of separation wreaked havoc on the family. That time of separation.
I think that's great. I think that's a great
wreaked havoc on the family. So that my grandmother and her sister were always like the stepchildren in a way to the rest of the family. And just
a natural distance born of time.
Right. And even like going forward, like 20 years later, that distance existed for them. And also that, the brothers asked for forgiveness, but except for Judah, they never apologized.
Yeah, I think even Judah didn't quite apologize.
Right, but they never really,
Right.
they ask for forgiveness, but they don't
Right.
apologize.
Right.
And I think.
Right, which underlines Ezra's point.
Right, and then with Joseph coming up, I think is kind of like a reference in the future to him being the second Messiah.
His line, a Messiah being born from his line as well.
Right,
yeah.
right.
All right, so just to respond to Paul's point, do we know anything about why it is that Joseph dies before his brothers? No, I don't. Sorry about that. If anyone else knows, please put in the chat.
Being that he's the youngest of them.
Okay. All right. A few more texts and we're going to close it up. Hold on a second. I lost it. Here it is. Oh no, that's not it. Let me try this one more time. I don't know why the text disappears like that. Let's see. It's not showing up, is it?
What are you looking for?
I'm looking for.
For which one? It's not on the screen.
On the screen.
It went black.
Okay, I'm gonna try one more time. Gil, if it doesn't work, I'll ask you to.
There we go.
Share. Okay, let's see. There it is. Okay. Okay, so let's just read these two and then end with a kind of covenant and blessing. So here in source 21 from Rachel Edelman, who's a professor at Hebrew College, she says, the brothers' shame remains unresolved because of the secrecy, silence, and judgment that surrounds their crime. They never move from the sense of shame to guilt, confession, and resolution. Joseph can no more rebuke his brothers than they can openly confess to their sin. His awareness of the divine plan and perhaps his own impulse to protect them from shame precludes the resolution of their guilt. It's an idea. So it becomes, in Zornberg's reading, the original sin which we collectively atone for in each generation. I mean, it is really hard for those of us who walk around with guilt, right? And, you know, the difficulty of communicating, especially with either a strange family or family members who are no longer alive. Like, what do you do with all that? Like, where does it go? Right? How do you resolve that? Okay, now more from Aviva Zornberg. It is striking that speaking upon the heart occurs only once more in Genesis. In the story of Dinah and Shechem, the prince first rapes Dinah and speaks to her heart. Very strange, right? Wow. There too, Rashi comments, words that found ready entrance to her heart. It's kind of disturbing to think about. He seduces her with promises of benefits to her family. The narrative conveys Shechem's impassioned sincerity, but does not blur the grotesqueness of a seduction that follows a rape. Here too, Joseph's seductive words cannot disguise the power imbalance and the fact of the pit. Right, so there's this tremendous power imbalance that I think Mark really, you know, provided like an excellent sort of image for, right? Like holding, he had all the power, right? Holding that arrow pointed at them. Even his promise to sustain their little children only reminds them of their infantile status, as indeed the expression he spoke upon their heart reminds the reader of his superiority. So this complete power balance, right, that brings us again, I think, into the master-slave relationship in Egypt for an entire people, literarily at least. Ambiguity, reassurance, and intimidation both hovers over his speech. Okay, two more. I'm actually finishing almost all my text today, which is unbelievable. Another Aviva. Like the nevermind response to an apology, Joseph's providential speech disturbs even as it purports to soothe. A hope of redress withers. The narratable anguish of the past is subsumed in a fiction of closure. Like, who was saying that? Yeah, Jay was talking about like this sort of papering over in order to move the narrative forward. And precisely here is the core of the irony. In his anxiety to reveal the end, to resolve the narrative in full meaning, Joseph suppresses the conflicts in his family and within himself. Stridently humble, he asserts a superiority that makes him untouchable and his brothers unredeemable. So here we are ending this book on a completely dark note, but something that gives me comfort again is, you know, the brothers and sisters and the heroes that we begin, you know, with the book in the book of Genesis. And even Moses himself reaches across like, you know, lines of national identity to help the Midianite women at the well, right? So there are all these people who cross over, right?
They're not completely dark. Not completely.
Well, no, in the next book is not dark. Here was dark.
But even now, not completely
Why
dark.
not completely dark?
Because completely is a very big word for even a rabbi of yours.
Okay.
I'm depressed.
We're talking extremist cat. It's
all right. Okay.
You're saying you're talking about black hole darkness.
All right. I'll try not to be quite as depressed.
Family
That
goes
makes
on.
Tony, the psychiatrist, happy. But, however, the book of Exodus does give me hope, and look how it ends, right? Just jumping way forward. כי ענן אדוני על המשכן יומם ואש תהיה לילה בו לעיני כל בית ישראל בכל מעשיהם. For over the tabernacle a cloud of Adonai rested by day, and fire would appear in it by night, in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. So what the Israelites, it ends with the vision of the Israelites and this vision of God's constancy, right? Tony must be awesome.
Can you say a word about who wrote these things, or are there two different authors?
There are many authors in the Torah. Okay, wait. So, my blessing for us today is that somehow we get through this dark moment, and I am depressed by this moment that we're in as a people, to some vision and some hope and some sense of constancy and you know, it's funny, when I first got to Israel, the first night, we saw this sign in Hebrew, you know, communication failure. And me and all the rabbis on the trip looked at each other and we said, right, right, massive communication failure. To the sense of like the point where communication can actually be possible, right? Be possible and be real. So with that, I want to say Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Many of you in services.